So Shadow Generations has been out for a couple months now, and as someone who loves Shadow's character and story, especially his character journey after Sonic Adventure 2, I've been thinking a lot about the story of Shadow Generations, and so that's what I want to talk about today. So obvious spoiler warning for the game if you haven't played it, and let's begin. So my thoughts on the story as a whole is that for what the story is trying to accomplish, I think it does it pretty well. And possibly even more importantly, in a way that I think most people will and have enjoyed. However, while I do think there's a good reason for that, and there's certainly something to be said about a story that's received the overwhelmingly positive response that this one has, personally, I didn't have the same positive response. And my problem with the story is, while I do think it has a lot of ideas that could work really well, and at least within the story that they're trying to tell, I think they do. But a lot of the time, the way that the story goes about exploring these ideas feels like they either misunderstand or simply don't adhere to the nuances of Shadow's character journey. Things like his morality or identity or the way his trauma is handled. But now, why do I think this way? So let's talk about that. So I think a good example to start off with here is with one of Shadow's big character developments in this game, which is learning to accept his past. Shadow spends a pretty significant portion of the game trying to either deny or distance himself from his past. He talks about not wanting to chase dreams and tries to convince himself that these things he's seeing aren't really there. Even after he realizes and accepts that Maria and Gerald are actually there, he continues to run from them out of fear of getting too close and getting hurt again. But by the end of the game, he accepts them as part of his past and is able to properly grieve their passing. However, I think the way they go about executing this doesn't fully lend itself to the spirit of Shadow's character. And part of that is because they only have him fully accept part of his past, specifically the part involving Maria and Gerald, as opposed to having him accept his entire past, even including the bad parts like Black Doom. But why do I argue that's an important thing here? I mean, why should Shadow accept Black Doom? Well, as part of this idea, they introduced this sort of moral dichotomy here, very similar to the one we see in the Shadow the Hedgehog game, which for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to refer to the game as Shadow 05 or just 05 for the rest of this video. This dichotomy is why we have Maria here talking about light and dark and whatnot. Now, we have these two opposing moral sides represented by Maria and Black Doom, but what I think Shadow Gens misses the mark on is what this moral dichotomy is meant to give Shadow in 05 and what it's meant to showcase in his overall character. So, what exactly does this do for his character in 05? Well, I'd say it gives him two main things. One is giving Shadow an individuality in his moral status that goes beyond this black and white concept of good and evil. In a game all about deciding whether you want to be a hero or a villain, part of Shadow's decision at the end of the game is that he is neither, or both, depending on how you want to look at it. Just as his theme song in the game says, Shadow has now learned to simply be himself. He is Shadow the Hedgehog, someone detached from this idea of an objective moral right. And the second thing this dichotomy does is facilitate Shadow's character arc around becoming his own person and following his own voice. In a game where more than half the decisions you can make are following other people trying to sway you to their side, with both sides telling Shadow what to do and who he's supposed to be, in the end, Shadow decides he's not going to follow any of them. That he will be the one and only person to decide who he is, and he's gonna do whatever he wants for himself, regardless of what everyone else wants him to do. But now, why do I feel like these ideas aren't properly portrayed in Shadow Generations? So, as part of this whole idea of Shadow accepting his past and this moral dichotomy is this concept of embrace the good, reject the bad going on with Shadow's character. And while I think this kind of writing works in many cases, for Shadow specifically, I don't think it really does. Going along with what I was saying before, Shadow is a character that is specifically meant to be morally gray. He is neither completely morally good nor completely evil. This is one of the main points of the different paths in Shadow 05. They're meant to show you the range of identities that Shadow could have become, from the protector of the world to the destroyer. again represented by Maria through her wish and Black Doom respectively. But there's a reason why none of those endings are the true ending, and it's because none of them represent who Shadow truly is at his core. That's why the canon ending and his characterization afterwards has always put Shadow more in the middle of this moral spectrum. His description as a dark hero uses both words used to describe the extremes of the paths in Shadow 05. And in that way, I think if you're going to have Shadow's arc be that he should accept his past, then I think you need to have him accept both sides just as he once rejected both, as opposed to having him accept the heroic while rejecting the dark. Because the fact is, the darkness is part of who he is. The head of Sonic Team has even talked about this multiple times recently, talking about how Shadow isn't a true hero and he doesn't want him to be that way. Now, there is a level of nuance to this because of Shadow's actual relationships with these characters, but I'll get more into that later. And this whole issue with Shadow's morality here is actually why I don't like Shadow losing the Doom powers at the end of the game. Obviously, there's also the fact that I don't like when they give characters these cool new abilities just to take them away, especially when they're super thematically fitting for the character. Like, it's one thing when a power is specific to the themes or story of that specific game, such as the cyber energy in Sonic Frontiers. In those cases, I think it's fine for a character to lose that because they more so pertain to the story rather than the character themselves. But in this case, it actually does have a wider meaning for Shadow's character. The Doom powers are basically symbolic of Shadow's connection to Black Doom. Black Doom either awakens or gives these powers to Shadow. It's not really explained. There's actually a lot of stuff in this game that's virtually unexplained in this story, such as how Black Doom just grew a new body and is now back, or how he gained control of the Time Eater's powers, but whatever. Anyway, as Shadow gains these powers, we see him get corrupted by them. We see Shadow become more aggressive and violent. Then we see Maria come in and tell Shadow not to give into darkness and to embrace the light. And I think this idea comes so close to being good, but again, it misses the mark. The thing is, the idea of Shadow being corrupted by darkness or Black Doom and needing to embrace the light to combat that, I don't think is a bad idea. Again, going to the idea of good versus evil, Shadow isn't supposed to be completely evil, so having him embrace the opposite side as a way of balancing him out, I think works. But my problem here is Shadow embracing the light isn't done in a way that balances him out, and instead, it essentially acts as a replacement to the darkness and completely switches him to the opposite side. This cutscene, and especially the optional dialogue afterwards, is essentially just Maria telling Shadow to be on the side of good, not the side of evil. She says, don't listen to Black Doom, listen to us. We're your real family, we're the ones who care about you. And that's exactly what Shadow does, because Shadow just kind of does whatever Maria tells him in this game. And again, in general, this kind of writing isn't necessarily bad, but for Shadow, I don't think it works, at least not in the way they do it here. As much as I think Shadow leaning too much into the dark side goes against his character, I also think him leaning too much into the hero side also goes against his character, because a major part of Shadow's character journey is his rejection of good and evil to become who he truly is. On top of that, the way they do Shadow's acceptance of Maria here removes a lot of Shadow's personal agency, especially because by the end of the game, Shadow claims he's just gonna live his life for Maria's wish again, but I'll talk more about Maria's wish specifically in a bit. Now, as for the way Shadow's acceptance of Maria is done here, a large part of this feels like it was done with the intention of wanting to keep Maria and Shadow's dynamic here pretty close to what it was when they were together on the Ark. But to me, it doesn't feel natural at all because of how different Shadow is, or at least is supposed to be now. Shadow's whole journey after his quote-unquote death in Sonic Adventure 2 is about him finding himself and learning to follow his own voice. In Sonic Adventure 2, we see a flashback of Shadow questioning his purpose and why he was created. He goes on to say that maybe if he goes to Earth, he'll find the answers he's looking for. And that's exactly what happens. Shadow goes to Earth and he has this big journey of self-discovery, mostly on account of his amnesia. And a huge part of his discovery is that he isn't the same Shadow that was there before. That for all intents and purposes, the Shadow from Sonic Adventure 2 is dead, and that the Shadow we have now is a completely different person. And this is something I'm going to talk much more extensively about later in the video, but this is why, even after learning all about his past and who he once was, he still actively decides to not be who he once was. This is even referenced multiple times in this game, with Rouge talking about how Shadow isn't the same person that Maria and Gerald once knew, and Maria and Gerald talking about how different Shadow is now. And the reason I bring up Shadow questioning his purpose in Sonic Adventure 2 is that Shadow never actually finds the answers he's looking for. Shadow is so caught up in fulfilling other people's desires and purpose that he never actually finds his own purpose. This is where this new Shadow comes in and essentially fulfills his past life's desires. He finds his own purpose, his own way, and he finds it in himself, being able to give himself purpose. The problem is, despite the game acknowledging these things about Shadow's story, when it comes to actually portraying them through Shadow himself, I think it kind of falls flat. To me, it doesn't feel like they wrote Shadow and Maria by genuinely asking themselves how this new Shadow would interact with her differently than the old. Instead, it feels like their interactions are written with the express purpose of having whatever emotional story beats they wanted to include, without actually asking themselves how to achieve those in a way that adheres to the nuances of the characters, or doing the proper narrative work to have these emotional beats work as intended. The biggest example of this for me is Maria's "This Isn't You" speech, which is a moment that I honestly think is completely unearned. First off, the idea that Shadow is being corrupted by these doom powers is practically introduced in this scene, where it is also immediately resolved. At no point before this does Shadow act even remotely out of character in the way that he does here that would make me think this was a plot point they were going for. Shadow doesn't act overtly more aggressive or evil than he usually does until this moment. And I do think in hindsight you could definitely make a case for previous moments being foreshadowing for this moment. Like, I guess he was kind of aggressive with those Doom soldiers when he was saving Maria, but it's not like I felt it was to the degree of being out of character where I'm like, whoa, calm down, Shadow. On top of that, this whole speech scene just feels extremely out of place given Shadow's entire arc in 05. Like I said before, Shadow's character arc in 05 was about personal agency. It was about him learning to do what he wanted regardless of everyone else. But I think this moment right here takes away from previous Shadow moments and the themes behind his character for a couple different reasons. I'd say the more egregious one here is that the entire idea of this scene is Maria stopping Shadow and trying to tell him who he is and what to do. But again, the whole point of his arc was that he was tired of people doing that and that he's gonna do that for himself from now on. So to have Maria sit there and do exactly that and just have Shadow go along with it, I think defeats the purpose of his arc. Now you may argue something like, but wait, this is a special circumstance because Shadow is being corrupted by the Doom powers. Maria is right in saying he isn't himself right now and therefore he needs her to be able to get a grip and go back to normal. Now I understand this point of view and that's clearly what they were going for in the scene. However, I think the way they go about it doesn't really fit the spirit of Shadow's character. If they really wanted to have a moment where Maria helps guide Shadow out of some internal conflict, I think there's ways to do that without compromising Shadow's arc. They've done it before with other characters. For example, in Sonic 06, after Shadow learns that Omega will supposedly seal him away in the future, he's clearly distraught and left wondering if everyone else really will turn on him in the future as well. But then Rouge chimes in and tells him that she'll always be on his side no matter what. This helps Shadow come to his conclusion later in the game where he resolves to fight back against the world if they choose to make an enemy of him. Now, Rouge's comment is not the one and only reason that Shadow is able to move past this destined future and have this resolution, but she clearly helps him along in getting there. And more importantly, she does it without just telling him what his decision should be. It's a way of having Rouge be part of his development without compromising previous moments. Now, this Maria moment could have maybe worked if they at least had a moment afterwards of Shadow being able to think for himself and do the necessary emotional work to be able to come to his own conclusion, but instead he just runs away after Maria's speech, then comes back 5 seconds later and he's just totally fine now. And you may say that Shadow kinda did come to his own conclusion because he does say that while he's letting go of his anger, he's also going to continue the fight anyway, and it's kinda worded as if that part is going against what Maria wanted, but really it's not. Maria was always fine with Shadow fighting. She didn't expect Black Doom to be killed with kindness. It was just him being overtaken by anger that she didn't like. The main issue here is no matter what, you're taking away Shadow's agency. one of the most important parts of his moment in Shadow of 5 is that he comes to his conclusion completely by himself. That it is only when everyone else is completely paralyzed and when this mess of voices in his head finally falls silent, it's at that point that Shadow is able to find and follow his own voice and completely act of his own volition. But when you give that moment to someone else and Shadow is just along for the ride, you take away what made that moment so impactful for him. This is because this whole idea of Shadow putting his past behind him in this game isn't actually about his past. Really, this entire thing is about Shadow's agency. That's the actual main theme of Shadow's entire character after Sonic Adventure 2. His past, his identity, and everything are really just vehicles to push this character arc for Shadow, but these things were never truly what it was about. That's why the idea of agency continues to be the main idea of Shadow's story in 06 as well, but this time Shadow's future is the vehicle that's used to push it. And so when you take big character moments and decisions away from Shadow and give them to someone else, you miss the entire point of his character. To illustrate this point a little more, I'm going to use Sonic as an example because he's actually extremely similar to Shadow in this way. Imagine if at the end of Sonic and the Black Knight, Sonic was about to give up the fight against Merlina, but this time, instead of telling him to run away, the other characters actually encourage Sonic and tell him to keep fighting. And Sonic's response to this is, "You're right, I have to keep going," and that's when he gets up and has his big transformation moment. That would completely go against the spirit of Sonic. Because even if the conclusion he eventually comes to is one that's in character for him to have come to in continuing to fight, the fact that he only came to that conclusion as a result of being influenced by other characters, that's what makes it go against the spirit of Sonic. What makes the actual moment such an amazing and emblematic moment for Sonic is his defiance of the other characters who are all telling him to give up. Because again, like Shadow, all Sonic wants to do is follow his own voice wherever that may lead him. He's also a character based in this idea of freedom and agency and living for yourself. That's why I don't like how Shadow's big moments here are given to or based on other characters and not Shadow himself. And kind of going back to what I was saying about this essentially being a new Shadow, another thing that really makes this moment feel unearned is the fact that Shadow is supposed to be super different now. But then they still give Maria this moment that hinges on the idea that Maria knows who Shadow truly is and knows what's best for him. Except she doesn't, because again, this is not the Shadow she knows. Maria has no idea about all the stuff that he's gone through across all these different games. She doesn't even know about the Arc Raid. Her entire mindset that this isn't who he is based on who he was when he was still living on the Ark with her. Her idea of Shadow is he's this super kind, pure-hearted, heroic person, and that's why he needs to embrace the light, because that's who he truly is. Except for the fact that he's explicitly not that. He is not a pure-hearted hero. He is meant to have a dark side that he doesn't shy away from. And it's because of this that this moment comes off as super forced to me, because this isn't her Shadow. She doesn't really know him, and so frankly, she just doesn't know what she's talking about here. And the thing is, just looking at Maria herself, I think this moment is perfectly fine and in character for her. Like, her seeing Shadow kind of turning evil in a way and wanting to help him is well within her character. She's not my problem here. Shadow is. His character is the one I think is suffering from the writing here, and this is how I feel about the entire story, honestly. Maria is written perfectly fine in a vacuum. My real issue is with Shadow. His response to Maria, how they have chosen to integrate Maria back into Shadow's story here, and how she's affecting him. Because again, Maria is right in saying that in this moment Shadow is not himself, but her understanding of Shadow and who he's supposed to be instead is also not who he is. It's the reason I don't like the idea of Shadow taking either her or Black Doom's side here, at least from a morality perspective, because Shadow's morality isn't supposed to completely align with either of them. This is also the reason why I argue that if you're going to have Shadow's arc here be that he has to accept the past, then he should accept both sides. And so my problem here is they have chosen to write Shadow around Maria and her understanding of who Shadow is, when really I think it should have been the opposite. Maria should be written around this new Shadow. Her kind of outdated understanding of Shadow should be challenged and used to exemplify how different he is, how much he's been through and developed. And concerning this idea of Shadow accepting both sides of his past, you might argue that Maria is the person that Shadow actually cares about and has a relationship with, as opposed to Black Doom, and therefore isn't treating them both the same, kinda downplaying Maria and her relationship with Shadow. And that would maybe be the case if what I was suggesting here is treating them both exactly the same, but I'm not. When I say that he should accept both sides, I just mean he should recognize that they are both a part of his past and not deny them anymore. But that doesn't mean he has to get along with Black Doom. Shadow could accept Black Doom by simply acknowledging that he is part Black Arms. That's just what he is, and have Shadow be okay with that and accept that as a part of himself. But he can still think that Black Doom is a monster who needs to go. That's why I think him keeping the Doom powers would have been much better and more thematically fitting for his character. And all my issues with this speech scene are only exacerbated by the fact that the next scene has Shadow say that he's just gonna go back to dedicating his life to Maria's wish, another moment that rids Shadow of his agency and replaces it with just Maria. Because Shadow has never once cared about the actual idea of giving everyone a chance to be happy. In fact, there's been multiple times throughout the series where he specifies that he doesn't care about that sort of thing. He talks about how he doesn't care what happens to others. He talks about how he is completely fine with taking on the world if he has to. The only reason this has or would ever matter to Shadow is because it is specifically Maria's wish. But again, the whole point of Shadow's arc was that he was tired of living his life for others, and he wants to live for himself. And I've seen a lot of people say that because Shadow is saying this to a Maria that hasn't experienced the arc raid yet, that Shadow's words here may have actually inspired what would later become Maria's wish. And so when Maria passes that wish onto Shadow in Sonic Adventure 2, it's almost like Shadow is actually passing it onto himself because he inspired the wish. And so in that way, you could argue that Shadow kind of decided his own life. And while I think that's a nice idea, it still has the exact same problem of this ultimately being Maria's wish and not Shadow's. No matter how it starts, no matter where he gets it from, the fact is he only cares about it because Maria cared about it. That's why it's always Maria's wish as opposed to Shadow's wish or their wish. And I've seen many people argue something like, well, what if what Shadow wants to do with his life is fulfill Maria's wish? Except that's just a roundabout way of getting to the exact same thing. The idea of Shadow just wanting to fulfill Maria's wish was exactly what he was doing in Sonic Adventure 2, and it's the reason he had no real agency in that game. The whole point of his arc in 05 is he's gonna do what he wants regardless of what everyone else wants. That's why making Shadow's motivation and life all about Maria and her wish and who she wants Shadow to be just ruins it for me. It also just creates a bunch of problems because of Shadow's moral standing as a character and what this turns him into versus what he's meant to be. Because if you completely change Shadow's morality, then you're going against the spirit of his character, because him being an anti-hero is one of his defining traits as a character. But then on the flip side, if you make fulfilling Maria's wish a goal that Shadow actively pursues without changing his morality, then I think that just comes off as super disingenuous. Because Maria actually is a character who's completely morally good or heroic, and her wish is a reflection of her good nature. That's why it's the pure hero ending of 05. So if you have Shadow trying to fulfill Maria's heroic wish through his not so heroic methods, that would just feel like a really insincere way of writing Shadow in his dynamic with Maria. Because Maria would absolutely not approve of Shadow's any means necessary pragmatism and mindset when it comes to accomplishing his goals. Things like breaking into a gun base to steal a spaceship would definitely not be the way Maria would want Shadow to handle this, especially since, as the commander says, he could have just asked, and Shadow knows that. But that's just not who Shadow is, and his morality and nature is an extremely important and defining part of his character. That's why Shadow being separated from Maria and her wish and her moral compass worked for Shadow's character, but trying to mix Shadow's moral character with Maria's wish just doesn't work in my opinion, and it ruins the dynamic they already had around Maria's wish, where Shadow in a way does fulfill it. Not because he does it with that intention, but rather he does it as a byproduct of his own actions. Shadow saves the world his own way and for his own reasons, but by doing so, he's still fulfilling Maria's wish, even if he's not doing it for her. And the fact that he does it in a way that she wouldn't really approve of doesn't really matter because he's not doing it for her. And it sucks because the game actually has the perfect visual symbolism for Shadow's moral standing. Shadow being depicted with these demonic wings while simultaneously being bathed in this golden light is the perfect visual symbolism of his moral character, just for it to not be backed up by the actual writing and for them to have Shadow strive to get rid of the darkness represented by the wings. And I think a lot of people will try and argue that Shadow's line about Maria's wish isn't saying he's gonna dedicate his life to her, that he's just doing it to honor her, or he's doing it for both of them, or something along those lines. And some may even point to Gerald's optional dialogue afterwards as proof. But Gerald's optional dialogue is part of the reason I don't agree. Gerald straight up tells Shadow that while his promise to Maria is good, it shouldn't be his sole purpose in life. Meaning Gerald saw Shadow's declaration here as him saying he's gonna make his promise to Maria his sole purpose, and Gerald is trying to sway him away from that. He's telling Shadow, hey, that's really nice of you, but you should have your own life, you should live for yourself. So even from Gerald's in-universe interpretation, even he is saying that Shadow is saying he's gonna dedicate his life to Maria's wish. And there's no good narrative purpose to having Gerald misunderstand what Shadow is saying just so he can give him redundant life advice. I also don't think that Gerald giving Shadow this life advice of re-explaining Shadow's own character arc back to him makes this any better, as it has the exact same problem as Maria's speech before this. Once again, it's a moment that takes away what should be Shadow exemplifying and reinforcing his own character and instead gives that moment to a different character, missing the entire point. Why would you regress Shadow's character just to have another character explain his own arc back to him? That to me just seems ridiculous and redundant. Even worse is that this is like the most important part of Shadow's character arc, and it's relegated to optional side dialogue rather than it being an actual important part of the main story. And I've seen some people argue that the reason they did this was because this game is meant to be a reintroduction of Shadow's character to newer audiences, so spelling out parts of his character and arc like this for newer audiences to understand makes sense, and that I actually agree with. But there are ways to do that while working with the character and not directly against them just to backtrack 5 seconds later in side dialogue. Considering the fact that his O5 arc is probably the most important development for understanding Shadow's current character, I think if you want to reintroduce Shadow to a new audience, then that should be one of, if not the biggest thing that you reintroduce and reinforce, and it should be done through your actual portrayal of Shadow. The thing is, there's actually multiple times in this game where they do attempt to reinforce Shadow's arc. In the recap cutscene you watch from the main menu, this is how they describe Shadow.
Shadow the Hedgehog, the lone dark warrior who judges the world by his own code.
In optional dialogue, Rouge talks about how Shadow isn't the same person that Maria and Gerald once knew. Even that optional dialogue from Gerald I was talking about is at least an attempt at reinforcing Shadow's O5 character arc. The problem is, none of these attempts are actually done through Shadow himself and his portrayal in the story. As I've talked about, I actually think Shadow's portrayal in this story works against his character arc in multiple ways, even though I think at least some of these attempts actually do a good job of describing Shadow, mainly the ending of the recap. But if Shadow himself, his words, his actions throughout the story are not properly reinforcing what he's being described as, then those descriptions are kinda meaningless. Especially when the actual portrayal of a character in-game is way more important than any kind of description you give them in side dialogue or a recap or whatever. And it's especially bad as a reintroduction for newer players. You gotta understand, most new players are never gonna look at the optional dialogue. They're gonna see the main story and that's it. And obviously I can't actually speak from the perspective of a new player, but I find it very hard to believe that the message new players are gonna walk away with is that Shadow is a character who lives for himself and not that he's someone who dedicates his entire life to his dead friend's wish. Even if they did read the optional dialogue, Gerald's line here and the idea of Shadow having his own purpose in life is not presented as a legitimate part of Shadow's character. It comes off more as a sort of fatherly advice, a nice but kinda inconsequential father-son moment, more so than it does a serious part of Shadow's character arc that he needs to or has already learned. But Shadow's line about Maria's wish, that is what's presented as actually important here. Most people being introduced to Shadow's character here would probably assume that his arc is about how Shadow was wrong and selfish to judge the world by his own code. Perhaps even that this was brought on by the death of Maria, that losing her caused Shadow to become more unfeeling towards the world and its people, which at least in Sonic Adventure 2, that was actually the case. And then now Maria has made him realize he should be good and help people like she wanted him to do, when really his character arc is the exact opposite of that, at least as it pertains to after Sonic Adventure 2. His arc was that he should be selfish, that he shouldn't live his life for others, and that he doesn't want to be good or heroic, not any more than he wants to be evil. And at least to me, that was one of the most interesting and unique parts about Shadow's arc in 05, because this idea of characters rejecting their past or putting it behind them is a very common trope used in writing, but a vast majority of the time, the idea is for a character to reject a solely evil past of theirs, or they're rejecting this one big bad that they've worked for or been with their entire lives or whatever to ultimately come out on the side of good. Or you also see a lot of the opposite, where a character starts off good and then you see their descent into darkness and becoming a villain. But part of what made Shadow unique in this idea was that he chose neither, that he rejected both light and dark so that he could simply be himself. The problem with all these moments that attempt to reinforce or expand upon Shadow's character is that all of them are given to other characters. Maria is the one who gets to decide what is and isn't Shadow. Rouge is the one who gets to exemplify that Shadow isn't the same Shadow as before. Gerald is the one who tells Shadow that he should find his own purpose in life. Maria is the one that tells Shadow that he has to let them go. But what does Shadow actually get? What moment does he get in the story where he gets to learn his own lesson? What decision does he get to make for himself? When does he get to be who he truly is regardless of others? The only thing he gets is at the very end against Black Doom when he says, "This is the destiny I choose," which is another very obvious attempt at reinforcing Shadow's arc that ultimately misses the point. This is a very common misconception I see on what Shadow's arc in 05 is really about, which is that a lot of people think his arc is about choice, that it's simply about him making a choice about who he is, what to do, what his purpose is, and then sticking to that. And that is certainly a part of it, but it's more than that. It's not just Shadow simply making a choice about who he is, it's about him making the specific choice to stop listening to everyone else's choices about who he is. He's not gonna be who someone else wants him to be just because they tell him that's who he should be. He's gonna do whatever he wants regardless of what everyone else wants. He's gonna do things of his own volition, because it's only when Shadow stops living his life based on others and their ideals and their desires that he can truly be himself. But you lose that entire idea when the destiny that Shadow chooses is based on someone else's wish, what they wanted him to do, who they think Shadow is, even though Shadow has shown that he doesn't actually share that person's ideals or desires. The situation that Shadow is forced into here requires a lot of emotional work for him to get through, only for none of that emotional work to be done by Shadow, and instead it's done by everyone else, mostly Maria, and Shadow just kinda goes along with it. And I think a lot of people would chalk up a lot, if not all of my criticisms with this story and the way that it's handled to Shadow's trauma. That because Shadow has this deep-seated trauma, and now he's being forced into this very traumatic situation of being face-to-face with these people again, all of these things make sense or are realistic. It makes sense for Shadow to lose his sense of identity or independence. It makes sense that Shadow would need to be directly guided to the proper conclusions, and he can't navigate this situation by himself. It makes sense for Shadow to regress as a person back to who he once was. All of these things are realistic trauma responses to the given situation. And while I understand the sentiment here, I have a couple problems with this justification. Number one, there's more than one way for a person or character to react to trauma, and I would argue that there are much more narratively interesting ways for Shadow specifically to react here. Number two, Shadow is a character who has historically had multiple unrealistic character arcs or conclusions in his stories. For example, in Shadow 05, Shadow's triumphant moment and conclusion in the last story is extremely unrealistic. Imagine if a normal amnesiac went searching for answers about their past and who they are, only to find out that they were created by a scientist who made a deal with the devil and endangered the entire planet for their creation, and the only reason the devil agreed was because the creation was supposed to be their slave. That would psychologically destroy a normal person. Nobody would realistically come out the other side of that and be fine. Especially not saying, you know what, I don't care about my past anymore, I'm gonna kill the devil and be my own person. Much less not 5 seconds after they found out. Same thing with 06. For all intents and purposes, Shadow turning on humanity because of their future betrayal would probably be a more realistic decision than the one he actually made, especially right after it was revealed that his own friend would be the one to seal him away. Neither of the choices that Shadow makes here are realistic, but that's what makes them compelling. It shows Shadow's strength of character through his ability to be true to himself despite having every reason not to. And the last reason I don't agree with the realism argument is, even if Shadow's trauma was the one simple reason why all of this stuff is written the way that it is, it doesn't actually change my issues with the story, and I still find this to be an extremely unsatisfying way to handle Shadow's story. Typically, when writing a character that struggles with trauma, you'd make that trauma a part of their character arc, usually by having them overcoming said trauma be a big step or the conclusion to that character arc and give them a satisfying ending in that regard. This is especially true if the character has already previously had that moment, and now you're challenging that character by essentially having them relapse for whatever reason, like what happens here. In this way, I would argue the most satisfying way to conclude Shadow's character here would have been to have him realize that he is being consumed by his trauma and regressing as a person, and then have him overcome that and once again resolve to be his own person. But that's not what happens here. Instead, Shadow's regression here is treated as triumphant or a good moment for his character, and this is just how he's gonna be from now on. And he never gets that moment where he properly gets to overcome his trauma and resolve to move past it. Instead, the ending of the game has him cling on to Maria till the very end, and he only lets them go because Maria told him to. And sure, in the end, he finally gets the chance to grieve them, but to me, it just doesn't feel like a satisfying ending to his character at all. This all just feels like a giant step back for his character, but in a way that's partially the point here, right? The idea here is that Shadow had to take this step back and face his past so that he could properly accept and grieve it. In that way, sure, he had to take this step back, but now he has a better foundation so that when he starts moving forward again, he can go further than he could before. And that idea is nice on paper maybe, but the way they do it here, I just don't like, because now the direction he's moving in with this new foundation is a regression of where he was going before. No matter how far he moves in that direction, it'll always be a step back from where he was, because Shadow doing things of his own volition was the step forward from Shadow living for Maria. It also just makes Shadow's moment in 05 retroactively so much worse, because now we're taking this triumphant moment from Shadow and making it seem like he was wrong or misguided for doing this, that it was bad of him to decide to live for himself and do what he wants, and that he should live his entire life for someone else, or that the only reason that Shadow made this decision to live for himself was because he was running from his past, and so this was just a coping mechanism, and so his healing from his past trauma also entails that he stops living for himself, and that by accepting his past, it means he should live for this person from his past because that's the healthy way to live his life. But that's such a terrible message to send to people, except that's not the message we want to send to people, because Gerald tells Shadow that he should live for himself. But then why don't we actually portray him like that? Why isn't that being shown and reinforced as a legitimate part of Shadow's character? Why are we regressing him just to do damage control in dialogue that 90% of players aren't even gonna look at? Like, you wouldn't need to backpedal like this if you just portrayed Shadow correctly in the first place. But the thing is, portraying Shadow's conclusion in 05 as misguided is partially the point here, right? The story of Shadow Generations is meant to be a sort of deconstruction of Shadow's decision in 05, at least as it concerns his past and his decision to leave it behind. The proposal that this game makes is that Shadow was only partially right in that decision, that by rejecting his past, he has successfully rejected the bad parts of his past, such as Black Doom. And that's a good thing, he should reject those things, but because he made the decision to reject his entire past, that also means he's rejecting the good parts such as Maria and Gerald. This idea that putting the past behind him, not letting it define him and whatever, was a good decision, but he took it too far, and now he's dealing with the consequences of rejecting the good parts of his past, because by rejecting those good parts and therefore these people that he still cares about, he never actually gave himself a chance to accept what happened to them and grieve their passing. This entire time he's just been running from it to not deal with the pain of losing them. But now, here in this game, he's learning that he should have more of a balance, and this goes back to an idea idea that I talked about way earlier in the video of embrace the good, reject the bad that we have here. That Shadow should accept Maria, but continue to reject Black Doom. This is what this entire idea is leading up to. These things go hand in hand. And once again, for the story that they're trying to tell here, I think this is done well. But also, once again, I think this misses the actual point of Shadow's story in 05. Why he actually made the decision to leave behind his entire past, because here they portray it as if he did it because he was running from the pain of losing Maria, but that's not why he did it. And this brings me to what is my biggest problem with Shadow's character here, and this isn't even really about the game itself or how he's written here specifically, but rather my issue is the direction that Sonic Team has decided to take with Shadow's character, mostly in regard to his trauma and memory. Because Shadow was never like this until now. Because Shadow never fully recovered from his amnesia. At least before Shadow Gens, Shadow having all of his memories back was a huge misconception among the fanbase, in large part due to things like bad localization in both Shadow 05 and Sonic 06, as well as Sonic Battle, and that one I'm definitely going to get to because that's a bit of an interesting story. But anyway, these things led people to believe that Shadow's conclusions in those games were based around Maria and her promise, and therefore Shadow must have all of his memories, but that was never actually the case. I've touched on this a couple times already in this video, but one of the things that I love most about post-05 Shadow is that him and Sonic Adventure 2 Shadow are essentially two different characters. The thing is, for all intents and purposes, Sonic Adventure 2 Shadow is dead. He died at the end of that game. But now you might say, well, how is that possible? He's clearly alive. And that's kinda true. Shadow is alive and kicking, but Sonic Adventure 2 Shadow is not. Due to Shadow's amnesia, the Shadow we have now is basically a new Shadow. Shadow's old memories, his personality, his desires, his dreams, all of those things were lost when he dies at the end of Sonic Adventure 2. And without those things, he's simply not the same person anymore, but that's the point. This is meant to facilitate Shadow's arc from Heroes onward about him becoming his own person. Part of the reason he chooses this path for himself is exactly because he lost his memories, and therefore feels like he's not the same person he was before. Even after learning all about his past from other people, he still makes the active choice to not go back to who he once was, because even though he now knows that all of this stuff happened in the past, he doesn't actually remember it happening. It's like someone telling you a story that you're part of, but you don't actually remember that stuff happening. On top of that, the other things he lost, like his desires and dreams, those remain gone too. But this actually ends up being a blessing in disguise for Shadow, as he decides he doesn't actually want those things back anymore. Shadow learning about his past from an outside source actually allows him to look at his past from a third-person perspective, and he realizes his past kinda sucks. At least among what he is told or remembers, it's virtually all bad. It's filled with tragedy and death and the devil, but most importantly, almost every single person who Shadow has ever met in his life keeps trying to tell him who he should be. Maria, Gerald, Eggman, Black Doom, Gun, everybody. Shadow's entire life is people pushing their agenda, whether it be good or bad, onto Shadow. But the thing is, in Sonic Adventure 2, Shadow welcomes this, particularly as it pertains to Maria. Shadow took Maria's wish and immediately made it his sole purpose in life, and the reason he does this so readily is because he doesn't know what else to do. His memories and Maria's wish are the only things he has to cling to in his life, and the one thing he's afraid of more than anything is living a meaningless existence. Shadow is a being that's burdened with immortality and an immunity to disease. He's gonna live forever, but what's he supposed to do in this never-ending life? That's why he wants to find his own purpose. He wants to find meaning in his life. And so he clings to Maria's wish, not just because it's his friend's dying wish, but because in his eyes, it's the only thing giving him purpose in life. But then Shadow 05 happens, and now these people are trying to push their agendas onto him again, and this time he hates it. People point at Shadow and blame him for stuff that he was never involved in. They expect him to keep promises that he never made. They expect him to take a certain path because that's what the old him did. And now Shadow looks at these people and his past and he thinks to himself, why would I even want this? This sucks. I don't want to go back to my old life. I want to be who I actually am now. I refuse to live my life for other people anymore. I'm gonna be my own person and do what I want to do. It's this triumphant moment of Shadow achieving the agency and freedom he never had, because his life before this was always dictated by others. He never actually got to be who he truly is and do what he wanted. This is why he says goodbye to himself at the end of the game. He's saying goodbye to the old Shadow, his old life. And although it's not localized properly, Shadow's line here is actually supposed to be the same goodbye line that both Maria and Sonic give Shadow in Sonic Adventure 2, a line that's meant to signify that this character is never gonna see Shadow again, which also gives more meaning to Sonic using that line because that was the last time Sonic saw at least that version of Shadow. You could also say this about Maria because even though we now have Shadow Gens, it's the same case of that being the last time that version of Shadow saw Maria. And this moment is emphasized by Shadow throwing away the picture of Maria and Gerald, who pretty much completely embody the old Shadow. Shadow's old life completely revolved around these people, and everything about him was because of or for them. But now, he doesn't need them. His life and purpose no longer revolve around them. On top of that, without his memories, he no longer has a personal attachment to them. That's why there's no sense of remorse or struggle at this moment. He's not sad to let them go. He doesn't look at this picture or their memory with care or grief. He just tosses it away. He's done with that life and he's glad to be done with it. And I love this moment so much because of how powerful it is in regards to Shadow's character and his themes. And that's the real reason why Shadow put his entire past behind him, because none of it is truly his. He wasn't running from the pain of losing Maria or Gerald. For all intents and purposes, he didn't even really lose them. That's not the life he lived. That's why I don't like what they did with Shadow's memories and trauma in Shadow Gens. That's why I don't like this balance between what he should and shouldn't reject about his past, or the idea of him taking it too far. I think it misses the point of why it applied to his entire past. On top of that, this idea of a new Shadow is also a huge part of what allows his death in Sonic Adventure 2 to still have the impact that it did without having Shadow's return take away from that. Because again, for all intents and purposes, that Shadow did die. The Shadow that loved Maria and spent all that time with her and fought for her dying wish died to fulfill that wish. And after living and dying for others and never really having his own agency and finding his own purpose, they were reborn as someone who does live for himself, someone who went to Earth and found his own purpose and answers just like Sonic Adventure 2 Shadow wanted. This new Shadow fulfilled the desire of his old self. But now you may be thinking to yourself that there are some flaws with my analysis here, such as the fact that Shadow does have his memories. We clearly see in Dark Beginnings that he remembers most of, if not everything that happened to him in the past. We also see that Shadow does still care about Maria. That's why he has this trauma and grief surrounding her death. I mean, they have an entire song about it in Dark Beginnings, and you would be completely right in saying that, and that's my exact problem, because it's true that Shadow is like that now. The problem is he was never like that before Shadow Gens. That's why after Shadow 05, Maria practically disappeared from the series for like a decade. She was never mentioned or thought about or anything, certainly not by Shadow. Even when things were brought up that might remind him of his past and Maria, such as when Eggman talks about Gerald in Sonic Rivals 2, he has no reaction. Even when you look at the plot of something like 06, which heavily involves humanity in their relation to Shadow, which would be the perfect time to bring up Maria considering how connected she is to humanity in her plot lines, she doesn't show up at all, because she just wasn't important to Shadow's current characterization anymore. It wasn't until like 2016 that they even prominently featured Maria in side material again and implied that maybe Shadow still thinks about her or is reminded of her every once in a while or whatever, because again, Shadow is supposed to have still lost his memory. Also, I'm not counting the Archie comics here because those are non-canon and have never really followed the games anyway. Here's the thing, there is absolutely no scene in any Sonic game ever where Shadow regains all of his memories. Like, he lost them. They were gone. That was it. There are a couple cutscenes in Shadow of 5 where he gets glimpses of his memory, but one, obviously these glimpses are not even close to his entire past, and two, none of those cutscenes are technically canon anyways. None of the cutscenes in 05 are technically canon except for the first one and the last story, because there is no definitive canon route in Shadow of 5. All the different routes are meant to represent possibilities for Shadow, but ultimately none of them truly represent him. That's what the last story is there for. And you may argue that it makes sense for Shadow to have eventually regained his memories, that it's been a long time since Shadow of 5, and so the idea of Shadow slowly regaining all of his memories and then now he has all of them makes sense. And I agree that it makes logical sense for this to have happened, but just because it makes sense doesn't automatically mean it's what's best for a story. I would argue from a storytelling perspective, this is a terrible way of handling Shadow's memories. He loses them in Sonic Heroes, he decides he doesn't care about them anymore in 05, and now, 20 years later, he just has them again. Like, I hate that. But now, let's go back and talk about Sonic Battle, because there is a good reason why I don't count it here. And I would actually argue this game may be the biggest factor in the misconceptions around Shadow's current character. So Sonic Battle is a game that actually does feature a Shadow that does have all of his memories and still cares a lot about Maria. He talks about how she'll always be in his heart and how he wants to bring hope to humanity and stuff like that. So then, case closed, right? Well, no, because most people fail to consider when the game came out. You see, Sonic Battle was technically Shadow's reintroduction into the series after his death in Sonic Adventure 2, as this game actually predates even Sonic Heroes by about a month. So the reason that Shadow is written like Sonic Adventure 2 Shadow in this game is because he is. That's what his characterization is based on. But then they made the Shadow of 5 game and decided to explore his past and morality and all these different facets of his character, and with that came a completely different direction for Shadow's character than the one we see in Sonic Battle. And remember, Shadow of 5 wasn't planned until after the release of Sonic Heroes, so it's pretty likely that they didn't come up with this new direction for Shadow's character until after Sonic Battle came out. I actually have a theory that his battle characterization was the original intended direction for his character after the Amnesia plotline was done, but then with Shadow of 5 they decided like, oh, actually, what if we did this instead? But the thing is, if you think about Sonic Battle from a timeline perspective, the logical conclusion on when this game takes place is after Shadow of 5. That's really the only point that even kinda makes sense here, especially because they name drop Omega in this game despite the fact that he technically didn't exist yet, and so most people either think this game came out after Shadow of 5 and therefore this is the proper direction for his character, or they've just never thought about it. But like, obviously, why would you, you know? You wouldn't typically look at a game and question any possible continuity errors it may have, especially when, like I said, the bad localization of other Sonic games has already led people to believe this was the direction of Shadow's character, such as how in the original Japanese for 05, after the message from Gerald about Black Doom, Shadow is able to stand up because now he finally knows the whole truth about him and Black Doom. He now knows he was made with the intention of being the one to beat Black Doom and therefore has the ability to resist him. As he says, he no longer has anything else to search for. Now he can fulfill Gerald's wish and finally put his past behind him. This is meant to essentially be closure for Shadow. In his eyes, beating Black Doom and therefore fulfilling Gerald's wish is the last bit of unfinished business left over from his past life. Once he's done with that, he can finally move on knowing there's nothing left. He can finally live his own life detached from his past. But in the English localization, it's more so made out to be like after seeing Gerald's message, Shadow claims he's here to fulfill his promise to Maria, that her and her promise have given him the strength to resist Black Doom and keep fighting, and therefore he's doing this for her wish, but that was never actually the case. This is just a problem with the Sonic series in general, especially recently they try to have this coherent canon timeline because that's what fans have been clamoring for, but the canon is so broken and makes no sense and is full of retcons because Sonic was never meant to have a super serious canon. Most of the games were meant to be self-contained stories that very loosely tied into each other in ways like new characters that were introduced are now in the new stuff. But now here's the thing. While Shadow Gens is the first game post Shadow 5 to even mention the idea that Shadow has his memories back, there was actually a side story that came out a couple years before this that touched on this idea, that being the Sonic channel story between Sonic and Shadow. In it, Sonic points out the arc to Shadow which could be seen from Earth, and Shadow has a noticeable reaction to it. It's also said that nobody really knows how much of Shadow's past he actually remembers at this point, but it's implied that he remembers at least a lot more than he used to, as well as implying that he does still care about Maria, as it talks about how he gained and lost many precious things while he was on the arc. And this is really where my problem stems from, and it's why I said this isn't just a problem with Shadow Gens, but rather an issue with the recent direction they've taken with Shadow's character. Now, many people would probably look at this story and say it's a good thing, because it adds nuance to Shadow's character, which is good, right? However, there is such a thing as bad nuance, and especially a bad approach to adding nuance, and that's where I'd personally argue this falls, because the idea of just giving Shadow back all of his memories and making him care about Maria and Gerald and everything again is a massive shift to make for his character, one that I think if they were going to do it, then it should have been handled with way more care, and especially should have been an actual important plot point in Shadow's story, not something that's just added off screen and now we just act like that's how he's always been, when that was never a thing until this. Handling it like this only works to turn modern Shadow back into Sonic Adventure 2 Shadow, which takes away from so much of what his post-Sonic Adventure 2 character journey was all about, especially because it's not really handled at all. It's just thrown in despite how much this really changes the direction of Shadow's character. And this is being added in a fairly obscure side story. I would bet not even 20% of the fanbase has even read this story. So now when Shadow Gens rolls around, Shadow having back all of his memories is pretty much completely out of nowhere. Now, in and of itself, I don't really think this side story and the way it handles Shadow is that big of a deal. The reason I bring it up is more so to illustrate my point about this being a larger problem with the direction of Shadow's character rather than something specific to the writing of Shadow Gens. But if this had been the only time that Shadow is written like this, then it wouldn't really have mattered to me. It's kind of like how I would consider Sonic Battle to be a major Flanderization of Amy, but this is the only game where she's characterized like this, and it's not even a mainline game, so like, I just don't care that much. But now we have Shadow Generations, and my problem with the lack of proper handling for this shift in Shadow's character is the same issue present in that side story, but this time on a much bigger scale. Now, at the very least, this time it's an actual game, which I think is the proper place to have this sort of big directional change, but it still has all the same executional problems, and I would argue they're even worse here, because the shift in Shadow's character in the Sonic channel story was way smaller than it was in Shadow Gens, at least relatively speaking, because the way they do it in the Sonic channel story is, oh, nobody really knows how much Shadow remembers or cares, but there are implications, which is definitely still a big change to his character, but that's nothing compared to giving him straight up deep-seated trauma, implying that Shadow thinks about Maria constantly and has this overwhelming longing for her. Like, this is such a drastic shift in Shadow's character, and it just happens off screen. And you may argue like, oh, well, the reason he's like this here is just because of the situation. He's given these visions of the tragedy by Black Doom, which leads him to having to go back to the Ark, which stirs up even more memories, and on top of that, later he comes face to face with these people from his past. But the reason I don't think that makes it any better is because that still has the same problem. Black Doom's vision going back to the Ark and even seeing Maria in front of his face would never give Shadow this type of reaction unless he already had that deep-seated trauma. Black Doom did not just give Shadow this trauma in his 5-minute vision, and it's very clear in the way that Shadow acts and talks that these feelings are not new to him. Where before, Shadow couldn't have had this kind of trauma about the death of Maria and Gerald because he could barely remember them. This is also why I've always disagreed with another common argument I see, which is like, oh, well, of course Shadow still cares about Maria and Gerald. Those people were a big part of his life. It'd make less sense if he didn't care about them anymore. And sure, when you just give him back all his memories and basically revert him back to his old self, then yeah, I agree with that. But that idea defeats the entire purpose of him being this reborn person who doesn't have the same memories or desires or wants as his old self. And the irony of this entire thing is I actually think this game would have been the perfect time to introduce and explore the idea of Shadow getting back his memories, because I don't necessarily think it's a bad idea. I actually think it could have been really interesting. Like, imagine if this had been used as an internal conflict for Shadow. If Shadow just started gaining back these memories against his will, and it starts to inadvertently make him start to care more about Maria again, and it becomes this big internal conflict for Shadow because he doesn't want this. He doesn't want these tragic memories. He doesn't want to go back to his old life. He wants to live his own life. And you can make his character arc similar to 05 or 06, where these memories are sort of tempting him to regress back to his old self, but then have him reaffirm that he doesn't want that. You can even include the idea of him accepting his past instead of outright denying it, but still have him leave it in the past. Have him realize that his past playing out the way that it did, no matter how terrible it was, is also the only reason that Shadow is where he is right now. The arc being raided, him being sealed away, him dying for Maria's wish, all those things are what allowed Shadow to be reborn and give him the ability to have more perspective on his life and realize he wants to live it for himself. Had things played out differently, he'd probably still be living for someone else. His old life's tragedy is what allowed him to achieve his greatest desire in finding his own purpose in life. There's honestly so many things they could have done with this idea that all get completely wasted by this just getting off-screened. And it really does suck because honestly, it seems very clear to me that Ian Flynn did try to preserve what he could of Shadow's 05 character arc. I even remember that on his podcast, he got a question from someone asking about a character bio for Shadow that said he only acts in honor of Maria, so here's how that interaction went.
Here's a question from Joseph. What is up with Shadow's bio on the Fast Friends Forever website? According to the bio, Shadow is fighting to protect the planet, but only for the sake of Maria's memory, while having no personal investment in the planet itself. But wouldn't making this aspect of his character the main reason for his protection of the planet be a regression and a contradiction to his development during Shadow the Hedgehog's final story? How come he's going back to doing everything for Maria's wish if he already did all that without those memories, learned to move on from his past and her promise, and was written in 06 to show himself as a hero on his own terms?
That is a very good question. It is very valid, and I cannot talk about it right now.
Situation we're in.
That is not a hand wave. This is very legitimately, there is other stuff that plays into this that I cannot get into just yet. So hold your horses.
Now, obviously, I can't claim to know what all of that was about, but it makes me think he knew that there were issues with this portrayal of Shadow, but that's what Sonic Team wanted, so that's what he had to write. And that character bio came out a couple years ago, like way before this game, further emphasizing my point about how this wasn't a natural direction for Shadow's character, and they just kind of changed him off screen. And now they're trying to make it work for his character, and I just don't think it does. Like I said before, the game has no shortage of acknowledging Shadow's character arc and attempting to reinforce it, but it's done in all the wrong ways. To me, it feels more like backpedaling or damage control more than it does a larger part of Shadow's story. It's like this game tries its hardest to have Shadow's character be a mix between 05 and Sonic Adventure 2, and I honestly think it just doesn't work, because those two characterizations are fundamentally opposed to each other. They were specifically written to be that way. You can't have Shadow's goal be to fulfill Maria's wish or honor her memory or whatever, while also making him live completely for himself regardless of others. Those things simply can't exist together, and trying to mix them together just ends up with this have your cake and eat it too situation that Shadow Gens has. And I think even worse is how much more prominently his Sonic Adventure 2 characterization is here compared to his 05 character. Like I said before, almost every bit of attempting to reinforce his 05 character arc is in optional dialogue or recaps, whereas the entire main story heavily works towards turning Shadow back into Sonic Adventure 2 Shadow through his relationship with Maria, even down to all the emotional work that Shadow has to do in this game, which is to say that he does none of it, and instead it's all done for him by Maria to give this game these emotional moments that, in my opinion, don't feel earned. The entire story of this game just feels like an attempt to turn Shadow's story into what most people want or misunderstand his story to be without actually considering the nuances of what his story actually is. And obviously everyone is entitled to their own opinion, and if you like this direction for Shadow's character better, then fair enough, and I can't argue with the results. A vast majority of the fandom enjoyed the story here, and there's definitely a lot of merit in that. I just wish it didn't come at the cost of what I find to be a far more interesting story story and character. I think a much better way to do this would have been to use this game to help people understand why Shadow's story was so amazing rather than just changing it. Cause I find Shadow's story, specifically his story in 05, to be one of the most misunderstood parts of the franchise, whether that be because people have just never played it, or they don't like the game, or the bad English localization, or whatever. And I think that's kind of emblematic of the larger issues with Sonic Team and their tendency to change their vision for the series or these characters on a whim to be able to appeal to people. But that's a completely different video. Anyway, if you've watched this far into the video, whether or not you actually agree with me or my points here, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a fantastic day.